passage comes from Mark 11, and it follows a story that appears in all four Gospels. So there are only 7 stories like that, all right, that appear in all 4. It's kind of interesting. So it's a very defining moment in Jesus' ministry, one way or another. In John, it shows up earlier in the Gospel than it does in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it's there. It's when Jesus comes in and clears out the money changers from the temple. So they were doing business in God's house. They were selling various sacrifices so that people could fulfill the law. That's what they were doing. And Jesus felt as though it was polluting God's house because he felt they were taking advantage of those who needed to purchase the animals. So he cleared it out. And at least in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that created the moment when he was in such conflict with the religious leaders that he was going to end up on the cross. A little different in John, but in the Synoptic Gospels, that's the way it goes. So we often think that, Jesus cleared out the temple and then he took off. And that's not how it worked. He cleared out the temple and he taught, and then he left for a night, and then he came back and he taught some more, and back and forth he went for a while. Okay? It was in one of these coming into the temples later in the week that he came to Jerusalem. And as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them?" And Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I'll tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Answer me." They argued with one another. "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But shall we say of human origin?" Then they were afraid of the crowd, for all regarded John as truly a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. Would you pray with me? Spirit of God, would you bring the text alive for us in a world that is very different and yet very much the same as the one in which it was written? In Christ's name we pray. Amen. On whose authority do you do what you do? On whose behalf do you act? It's a question that's worth our asking. It's not just a question for Jesus or a question for the Pharisees, but a question for us. On whose authority and on whose behalf do we act and do the things we do, say the things we say? It becomes pretty clear pretty quickly if we ask that question that we act on our own behalf. And we act on the authority derived from a perceived reality that it's a dog-eat-dog world, and if we don't take care of ourselves, no one else will. That may not be true for everybody in this room all the time, but it's thoroughgoing in our culture. It's certainly the way we figure out the great controversies of our nation and of our time. Look at Ukraine. Oh, for a little while, it's about the morality. We need to support Ukraine because those horrible Russians came in and did awful things to them. But then you start listening to the political experts, to the people that are trying to figure out what to do, how much to support them, and you hear one of two things. Either, well, it's all the way over there, they really have nothing to do with us. And so why are we getting involved? That's not our business. It's not something that we need to be involved in. Or some others say that, well, actually, they're fighting for us. They're the ones that are doing the fighting and the dying, and we're spending money at home to build all these weapons. It's good for our economy, so overall, were acting well on our behalf. So either we don't care about them because they're over there, or we don't care about them because they're dying for us. Seems like we're acting on our own behalf, taking care of ourselves because who else will? Israel, Palestine. After October 7th, there was a great moral outcry, as well there should be. And we supported Israel in a big way. Now, anyone with a moral compass who isn't really directly involved in that conflict is certainly uncomfortable. There's lots of debate and argument about why things are happening the way they are. It certainly seems like a tragedy. There's a lot of hand-wringing going on in our country. A lot of worrying, a lot of protest, and I get that. So why can't we come together and figure out what to do to stop that war? Well, frankly, there are geopolitical concerns. We don't want to see Israel's security undermined because that would be bad for us. I could argue it might be bad for the whole world, but it would be bad for us to have their security undermined, to have other nations in that area begin to take hold in hostile ways towards the US of A. So we're acting on our own behalf, concerned about it, sure, but working on the authority of that perceived reality that it's a dog-eat-dog world, and if we don't take care of ourselves, no one else will. The media, of course, layers on the drama. The media enjoys it. It's how they make their money. I'm not sure who it was that said it originally, but I think I got this from Jon Stewart, this awareness that our media system seems to be set up to deal with a crisis like 9/11 or the entry of Russia into Ukraine. Does a fantastic job in that moment. The trouble is, we're not always in the midst of a crisis like that, and if we're not, the media has to manufacture one. So we're always kind of built up, worried, strained. They're acting on their own behalf, trying to find their own way of dealing with things. It's interesting, I was listening to two young men, I can't even remember their names, but they're in a group called Uniting for a Shared Future. An Israeli travel agent and a Palestinian travel agent. They were Facebook friends before October 7th. And they managed to get together and understand these are people that have personally suffered from this conflict. Family members who've been killed. And yet they decided that there had to be a different way than the constant killing and maiming. So in spite of the anger, in spite of the hurt, in spite of the frustration, they have found ways to have conversation with one another, and they see a movement of people growing, both in Palestine and in Israel. More organizations than just them are beginning to bubble up and have conversations trying to find that other way of seeking peace through conversation, and yet they're having a very difficult time getting any traction in the media. Seems like people don't want to write that many stories about them. They were even embraced by the Pope. I know that Whoopi Goldberg and Jimmy Fallon and company saw the Pope, but I never heard these guys saw the Pope. Doesn't have traction because we're operating on the authority of that assumption that we need to take care of ourselves, and that's what the media seems to do. Now, I've kind of talk about it in political terms, in those big terms, because that lets us off the hook, right? We're not doing those things, but the reality is I act on my own authority. I act frequently as though I'm living in a world that is dog eat dog, and I have to make sure I take care of myself and my family because no one else will. So do you. And I've heard it in this congregation in different ways. You know, there's this debate or initiative, California Forever, that's come up. Anytime I hear it discussed in terms of how it will change my life, whether or not it's good for me. You know, am I acting on my own authority at that point as I discuss those things? How about how you spend your money? You get to spend and save your money. Are we doing it from the point of view of people who are trying to take care of themselves, build their own lives up, the focus on me? How about the way you spend your time, or your decisions about whether to forgive another human being who's hurt you, or to reconcile with that human being? Those are two very different things. Forgiveness takes one, reconciliation takes two. But when you make those decisions, are you making those decisions considering what's good for you, your own authority, or a larger whole? We all do this, just like the Pharisees. You know, the Pharisees had perfectly justifiable reasons to be selling those sacrificial animals in the temple. It was convenient. You know, they were just trying to help people get by. You know, they come to the temple. What are they going to do? They need a couple of turtle doves, so we have them right here. You know, the assumption of scholars is that the prices were usury. It wasn't really fair. Okay. But I think the Pharisees could probably say, well, don't we deserve a cut for making these things really easy to do so people can be faithful to their God? I can see how they might think that through and consider it to be moral. So they go to Jesus, who wants to turn all that upside down, and ask by whose authority. And after Jesus plays this rabbinic game with them, he tells them a parable. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went away to another country. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized the slave, beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. And again, he sent another slave to them, and this one they beat over the head and insulted. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, and others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they seized him, killed him, threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? Well, he'll come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to someone else. Jesus did answer the question. He's operating on the authority of the God of heaven and earth. He's operating on the reality that he understands, that God is working in the world to perfect the world, to draw all things together in perfect harmony. He's operating with the reality that God cares for those that are downtrodden. He's operating with God's authority because God operates with the power of love and conversion, not the power that coerces. He understands what authority he's operating with. Do we? On whose authority do we act and do the things we do? Now, do I think that if our society just all of a sudden decided to ask the question, what would God want in this circumstance, that things would be okay? Absolutely not, because we wouldn't have any idea whatsoever what God would want. We don't even bring up the question. all these stories I told, all these examples I brought out. Never brought up the question. I've never heard it. It's not brought up. What is it the creator of heaven and earth is about in our world right now? What's unfolding before our eyes? On whose authority should we be acting? Can we be acting? I'd be happy if we just raised the question, but we're certainly not going to get the answer that easily. Jesus certainly wanted them to be asking the question, and that's why he cleared out the temple. Because in order to even begin to answer the question, how to live under God's authority, you're going to have to clear out the space far enough so that you have some relationship to the presence of God, that you can begin to read God's mind, to perceive the direction that God is taking our creation. And that takes time and effort. It's not easy. It takes the reformation of a human life and soul. All of us live in this society that thinks the way it thinks about that world where we have to take care of ourselves. We are infected by it. It's inevitable. And so all of us, as well as all the world outside, is in need of reformation, that our hearts and our minds need to be reformed in such a way that we've spent enough time in the presence of the Spirit of God that we begin to get a sense of the answer to God's questions, of the policies that God might direct us toward. To be able to be reformed like that, by the way, is to be born again. It's what it means to have the life of God living inside you and forming you day in and day out. Clear the space. It's a process and requires devotion. How much time do you spend allowing the presence of God to form your mind and your heart? I used to kid my first congregation that thinking about time, really God ought to get equal time with David Letterman. And the thing is, there are lots of ways to do it. For some people, it may be sitting in meditation. For other people, it may be the study of the Scriptures. There are lots of ways to go about it. Read what others think about how the Spirit is unfolding in the world around us. I'm trying to clear out the noise, the religious noise, the nationalism, the tiny magic God, rather than the enormous God who's unfolded creation, lo, these 13.82 billion years, maybe more. It's a process. So if I do go through that process and my heart is reformed, my mind is reformed, will I spend my money differently than I'm spending it now? Do the same things? Will I spend my time differently than I'm spending it now? Will I make different decisions about whether to reconcile with another human being that I know? If the society begins to be reformed, if the heart of God is connected to the heart of human beings more, will we have different approaches to the Ukraine issue, different approaches to Israel, different approaches to immigration? Will we change our policy about reproductive rights? Will we change our understanding of gender norms? I have no idea. But I do know that the tenor of the conversation, the way we talk about those things, will be very different than it is today. It'll have an entirely different focus. Rather than serving, acting on my own behalf, I seek to act on behalf of a God that loves the world and me. And the conversations we have will be very different because we are operating from the knowledge of a reality that God moves things from death to new life. That we can't avoid the death that comes with change. That we seek a healing and an improved, a greater harmonious life as things unfold. It takes great wisdom to understand what the Spirit of God is about. And unless our hearts are formed and reformed in that love, we can't even begin to figure out what is right and what is wrong. These are prophetic times. You can just feel it. You can feel that somewhere on the horizon, I don't know how far off, there's something starting to crack and crumble because we've been operating on our own authority, serving our own interests a bit too long. It's incumbent upon us to be reformed, to take that time, to find out where the Spirit of God will lead and direct us. Because I can't help but shake it, that feeling that the owner of the vineyard is coming. That's part of the unfolding of history. Empires rise and empires fall. Now we here in this community, we seek to be citizens of God's kingdom. We seek to have God's wisdom in our hearts and speak that in the world around us and act that way now. But I have great compassion for all of you and for me. Because this world we live in really does turn our hearts and minds upside down. It takes a real effort to focus our lives and let them be reformed. And sometimes we're afraid to do it. I mean, who knows? If God reforms our heart and mind, we might all of a sudden decide we should give our money to the poor and take off somewhere and serve people in, Guatemala or something. Some people are afraid that that's what will happen. I would suggest to you, though, that if your mind and heart become reformed, you're not going to be doing anything that you don't want to do. You're only going to be doing what the love of God is unfolding within your life. Each of us has an opportunity to continue to grow. And during these prophetic times, our words can impact the world around us. Just like Elijah scared Ahab. And Ahab decided, no, I'll turn towards the Lord. We can be prophets of a kind, not self-righteous, but we can be people that tell the world that our hearts and minds need to be reformed, so we're considering the entirety of creation and not just our little piece. Amen.
Whatever burden weighs you down, whatever flaw, whatever trauma you've experienced or dream that's been left unfulfilled in your life, know this. You are an expression of the creative love and power of God. You cannot be separated from God's love. God seeks your perfection and not your destruction.